The autumn wind swept through Millbrook's dusty main street, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of winter. It was 1887, and this small Colorado mining town had seen better days. The silver veins were running thin, and with them the hopes of most folks who'd staked their futures on these unforgiving mountains. Inside Murphy's saloon, the usual crowd had gathered, miners still black with coal dust, a few remaining ranchers, and the handful of shopkeepers who kept the town limping along. The kerosene lamps cast long shadows across weathered faces, and the conversation was muted, punctuated only by the occasional clink of glasses and the scrape of chair legs against the worn wooden floor. Sarah McKenna sat alone at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 28, she still carried traces of the beauty that had once turned heads, but months of fear had carved lines around her eyes that made her look older. The fading bruise on her left cheek, carefully hidden beneath a layer of powder, told a story that everyone in town knew, but no one dared speak aloud. "Another coffee, Mrs. McKenna?" asked Tom Murphy, the saloon owner, his voice carrying the careful neutrality that had become second nature when dealing with Sarah. "No, thank you, Tom. I should be getting home soon." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes constantly darting toward the saloon doors. At the bar, her husband Frank McKenna was well into his fifth whiskey of the evening. A former mine foreman who'd lost his job when the last shaft closed, Frank had spent the better part of 2 years drowning his failures in whatever bottle he could afford. His massive frame, once powerful and commanding, now carried the soft bloat of a man who'd replaced purpose with liquor. "Damn mine owners," Frank slurred to anyone within earshot, his words heavy with alcohol and resentment. 20 years I gave 'em. 20 years, and what do I got to show for it? Nothing but a worthless wife and bills I can't pay. The miners at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably. Most had known Frank before the drinking took hold, remembered when he was a decent man who looked out for his crew, but that Frank McKenna had died somewhere in the bottom of a bottle, leaving behind this bitter stranger who found fault with everything and everyone, especially his wife. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats on the hard-packed dirt announced another arrival. Through the bat-wing doors walked a man who immediately commanded attention, though he seemed to prefer avoiding it. Tall and lean, with steel-grey eyes and a weathered face that spoke of years under the open sky, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced trouble and lived to tell about it. "Evening," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat to the room in general. His voice carried a slight drawl, Texas maybe, or Arizona, and there was something in his manner that made even the roughest men in the saloon take notice. Tom Murphy looked up from cleaning glasses. "Evening, stranger. What can I get you?" "Whiskey. The good stuff, if you got it. We've got decent." Tom poured a generous measure into a clean glass. "Name's Tom Murphy. I own this place." "Jake Russell." The cowboy placed a silver dollar on the bar, more than the drink was worth. "Keep the change." As Jake settled against the bar, his eyes took in the room with the practiced assessment of a man who'd learned to read situations quickly. He noted the nervous energy, the way conversations died when Frank McKenna spoke, and especially the woman in the corner who kept glancing at the door like a bird ready to fly. "You folks seem a mite tense tonight," Jake observed quietly to Tom. Tom's expression darkened. "It's been a hard year. Lost most of our work when the mines played out. Makes people difficult." Frank's voice rose again, this time directed specifically at his wife. "Sarah, get over here. I'm ready to head home." Sarah's hands trembled as she pushed back from her table. "Coming, Frank." But as she stood, her foot caught the leg of her chair, and it scraped loudly against the floor. The sound was small, insignificant, but in Frank's alcohol-soaked mind, it became another affront, another excuse to unleash the rage that had been building all evening. "Can't you do anything right?" Frank snarled, lurching to his feet. "Clumsy as a damn ox, just like your mother." "I'm sorry, Frank, I didn't mean—" "Sorry don't fix nothing." Frank's voice echoed through the now silent saloon. Every conversation had stopped, every eye was watching, and every person in that room knew what was coming next. Jake Russell set down his whiskey glass with deliberate care, his grey eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. He'd seen this dance before, in a dozen different towns, with a dozen different men who used their fists to solve problems they'd created with their bottles. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Frank took a step toward his wife, his right hand already clenching into a fist. Sarah instinctively backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The wall was behind her, and her husband was closing the distance between them with the predatory certainty of a man who'd done this before. "Frank, please," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Not here. People are watching." "Let 'em watch," Frank growled, his fist rising. "Maybe it's time this whole damn town saw what happens when a woman don't know her place." In that moment, as Frank's fist reached its apex and began its descent toward Sarah's face, the saloon held its collective breath. 23 people sat frozen in their chairs, their drinks forgotten, their conversations abandoned. 23 people who'd built their lives on the principle that a man's business was his own, no matter how ugly it got. 23 people who were about to learn that sometimes silence isn't golden, it's cowardice. The metallic click of a hammer being pulled back cut through the saloon's tension like a blade through silk. "That's far enough, friend." Jake Russell's voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried the kind of authority that made Frank McKenna freeze mid-swing. The cowboy hadn't moved from his position at the bar, but his right hand now rested on the grip of the Colt. 45 at his hip, and his eyes held the flat, dangerous look of a man who'd crossed lines that most people only read about in dime novels. Frank's fist hung suspended in the air above Sarah's cowering form, his alcohol-clouded mind struggling to process this unexpected interruption. Slowly, he turned to face this stranger who dared to interfere in his private business. "This ain't your concern, cowboy," Frank slurred, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. The liquid courage that had fueled his rage was suddenly competing with an older, more primitive instinct, the one that warned him he might be in real danger. Jake took a slow sip of his whiskey, never taking his eyes off Frank. "See, that's where you're wrong. When a man raises his hand to a woman, it becomes everybody's concern, especially mine." The saloon remained frozen in tableau, Sarah pressed against the wall, Frank wavering between rage and fear, and 21 other souls who'd suddenly found themselves unwilling participants in a drama that none of them had asked for, but all of them would remember for the rest of their lives. Tom Murphy's knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the bar. He'd seen gunfights before, had even been in one during his younger days in Dodge City, but this felt different. This wasn't about cards or cattle or claim disputes. This was about something deeper, something that went to the heart of what kind of people they all were. "Frank," Tom said carefully, "maybe you should just take Sarah home, sleep off that whiskey. Things'll look different in the morning." But Frank McKenna was past listening to reason. The combination of alcohol, humiliation, and wounded pride had created a volatile mixture that demanded satisfaction. In his mind, this wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about respect, about showing this room full of people that Frank McKenna wouldn't be dictated to by some drifter with a gun. "You know what your problem is, stranger?" Frank said, his voice gaining strength as his anger overcame his caution. "You don't understand how things work in a proper town. A man's wife is his property, same as his horse or his house, and when property misbehaves, a man's got a right to correct it." Jake's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Property," he repeated softly. "That's an interesting way to look at it." He finished his whiskey and set the glass down with the same deliberate care he'd shown before. Then, moving with fluid precision, he pushed away from the bar and took 3 steps forward, positioning himself between Frank and Sarah. "Here's how I see it," Jake said, his voice still conversational but carrying an undertone of steel. "You're drunk, you're angry, and you're about to do something that you might regret for the rest of your life, however long that might be." Frank's face flushed red. Are you threatening me? No threat, just an observation. Jake's hand never moved toward his gun, but everyone in the room could feel the potential violence radiating from him like heat from a forge. See, I've known a lot of men who hit women. Every single one of them had a good reason, or at least they thought they did. Their wives talked back, or spent too much money, or looked at another man, or burned the dinner, always something. He took another step forward, and Frank instinctively backed up. You know what I learned about those men? Jake continued. They were all cowards, every last one, because it takes a special kind of yellow to pick on someone who can't fight back. Dodges. The insult hit Frank like a physical blow. I ain't no coward. Prove it. The two words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Every person in the saloon understood the challenge that had just been issued, and every person held their breath as they waited to see how Frank McKenna would respond. Behind Jake, Sarah had pressed herself so tightly against the wall that she seemed to be trying to disappear into the wood itself. Her husband's rages were familiar, terrifying in their predictability. But this was uncharted territory, and she wasn't sure if the stranger's intervention would save her or make everything worse. Frank's right hand twitched toward the revolver on his hip, an old Navy Colt that he'd carried since his cavalry days, but hadn't drawn in anger for more than a decade. The metal felt cold and foreign against his palm, and for a moment the fog of alcohol lifted enough for him to realize just how far things had escalated. But the eyes of the town were on him. His wife was watching. The stranger was waiting. And Frank McKenna's pride, that last stubborn remnant of the man he used to be, wouldn't let him back down now. You want to dance, cowboy? Frank's voice was steadier now, the adrenaline burning through some of the whiskey in his system. Then let's dance. Jake nodded slowly, as if Frank had just confirmed something he'd already suspected. If that's how you want it. The two men stood facing each other across 10 feet of sawdust-covered floor, their hands hovering near their weapons. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the saloon's windows and making the kerosene lamps flicker ominously. The sound seemed to come from another world, a peaceful world where men didn't settle their differences with gunpowder and lead. Wait, Sarah's voice cut through the tension, barely above a whisper but somehow audible to everyone in the room. Please don't. He's not worth killing. I'm not worth killing for. Jake's eyes never left Frank, but his voice gentled when he spoke to her. Ma'am, every person in this world is worth protecting, and every person who hurts innocent folks needs to answer for it. Tom Murphy cleared his throat. Gentlemen, maybe we can... Stay out of this, Tom. Frank's voice was cold now, focused. The alcohol was still in his system, but the proximity of violence had sharpened his reflexes and cleared his mind. This is between me and the cowboy. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching like an hour. Someone's chair creaked. A glass clinked somewhere in the back of the room, and still the two men stood frozen, their hands poised over their guns, their eyes locked in a deadly stare. It was Frank who moved first. Frank McKenna's hand dropped toward his gun with the desperate speed of a man who knew his life depended on being faster than his opponent. But 17 years of military precision had been eroded by 2 years of whiskey and self-pity, and his movements, though quick, lacked the fluid economy that separated the living from the dead in gunfights. Jake Russell's draw was poetry in motion, smooth, practiced, and devastatingly efficient. His Colt cleared leather and leveled on Frank's chest before McKenna's gun had even cleared his holster. The distinctive sound of a hammer being cocked echoed through the saloon like a death knell. Drop it. The words were spoken quietly, but they carried the absolute authority of a man holding all the cards. Frank froze, his own weapon half drawn, his face a mask of shock and dawning humiliation. For a long moment, the only sound in the saloon was the harsh rasp of his labored breathing. I said, drop it. Frank's fingers opened as if they'd lost all strength, and his revolver clattered to the floor with a sound that seemed to reverberate through every soul in the room. The man who moments before had been ready to beat his wife into submission now stood before them all, disarmed and defenseless, his true nature finally exposed. Jake held his position for another heartbeat, then slowly lowered his weapon. But he didn't holster it. "Kick it away." Frank complied, sending his gun skittering across the floor until it came to rest against the far wall. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd tried to rule through violence and intimidation was now as powerless as the woman he'd been terrorizing. "Now," Jake said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made everyone lean forward to catch his words, "I think it's time we had us a conversation, not just you and me, Frank, all of us." He gestured toward the room with his free hand, taking in the faces of every person who'd witnessed the confrontation. "See, I've been wondering something since I walked in here tonight. How long has this been going on?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Eyes that had been focused on the drama now found sudden interest in the bottoms of whiskey glasses, the grain of the wooden tables, anywhere but on each other. "How long?" Jake repeated. "Have you good folks been sitting here watching this man terrorize his wife and doing nothing about it?" Tom Murphy was the first to find his voice. "Now look here, stranger. You don't understand the situation. Frank's had a hard time since the mine closed. He's not usually what?" Jake interrupted. "Not usually a wife-beater? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he's got plenty of practice." Sarah, still pressed against the wall, seemed to shrink even further at the attention. The bruise on her face was evidence enough, but Jake could see other signs. The way she held her left arm close to her body, the careful way she moved, the haunted look in her eyes that spoke of months, maybe years, of living in fear. "Mrs. McKenna," Jake said gently, turning slightly so he could see her while keeping Frank in his peripheral vision. "How long has your husband been hitting you?" He doesn't..." Sarah's voice faltered, and she looked around the room at faces she'd known for years, neighbors, friends, people she went to church with every Sunday. "Please, I don't want to cause trouble." "Trouble?" Jake's voice sharpened. "Ma'am, the trouble's already been caused. The only question now is what we're going to do about it." Frank, his initial shock wearing off, tried to reassert himself. "This is family business, cowboy. Ain't none of you got any right to interfere." "Family business." Jake repeated the words like they tasted bitter. "Is that what you call it when you raise your fist to someone half your size? Family business?" He took a step closer to Frank, and the bigger man instinctively backed away. "Let me tell you about family business, Frank. Family business is protecting the people you love. It's providing for them, caring for them, making sure they feel safe in their own home. What you've been doing, that's not family business. That's just plain old cruelty." Dr. William Hayes, the town's only physician, spoke up from his table near the window. "Jake's right. I've treated Sarah 3 times in the past 6 months. Broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a concussion she claimed came from falling down stairs that don't exist in her house." The admission sent a ripple of uncomfortable murmurs through the crowd. It was one thing to suspect, another to have the evidence laid out so clinically. "Will," Frank snarled, "you had no right to—" "I had every right," Dr. Hayes interrupted, standing up from his chair. He was a small man, barely 5.5 feet tall, but his voice carried the moral authority of someone who dedicated his life to healing. "I took an oath to do no harm, and that includes staying silent when I should speak up." Margaret O'Sullivan, who ran the town's general store with her husband, cleared her throat nervously. "We all knew something was wrong, but, well, what could we do? Frank's twice my size, and my Patrick's not getting any younger." "What you could do," Jake said, his gaze sweeping the room, "is what you're doing right now. You could stand up. You could say this isn't acceptable. You could make it clear that in your town men don't beat their wives." Reverend Jonathan Pike, who'd been silent until now, rose slowly from his seat. He was a tall, thin man with prematurely grey hair and the kind of deep-set eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. "The stranger's right," he said, his voice carrying the weight of moral conviction. I've been praying for guidance on this matter for months, asking the Lord to show me the right path, and perhaps he has, in the form of this man who had the courage to do what the rest of us should have done long ago." Frank's face was purple with rage. "You sanctimonious Frank McKenna," the Reverend continued, his voice rising, "you have brought shame upon yourself, your wife, and this community. You have violated the most sacred trust a man can hold, the duty to protect and cherish his spouse, and we, all of us, have been complicit in our silence." The words hit the room like a physical force. Sarah began to cry. Not the quiet, fearful tears she'd shed so many times before, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from years of suppressed pain and terror. Jake holstered his gun and moved to her side, his voice gentle. "It's all right, Mom. You're safe now." "No," Sarah managed between sobs. "You don't understand. When you leave, when everyone goes home, I'll still be there with him, and he'll make me pay for this. He always makes me pay." The stark honesty of her words hit the room like a slap. Here was the truth they'd all been avoiding, that their moment of courage, their sudden attack of conscience, would mean nothing if it didn't translate into lasting protection for the woman who needed it most. Jake looked around the room, studying the faces of the people who called this place home. "Well then," he said finally, "I guess we need to figure out a solution that lasts longer than one night." The silence that followed Jake's words was different from the tense quiet that had gripped the saloon earlier. This was the silence of people thinking, calculating, wrestling with the realization that good intentions weren't enough, that real change required real action, and real action often came with a price. It was Margaret O'Sullivan who spoke first, her Irish accent thickening with emotion. "She could stay with Patrick and me. We've got the spare room above the store." "For how long?" her husband Patrick asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and was willing to accept it. "Frank's not going anywhere, and neither are we." Dr. Hayes adjusted his spectacles, his medical mind working through the problem like a diagnosis. "The question isn't just where Sarah can stay, it's what we do about Frank. A man who beats his wife once will do it again, given the opportunity." Frank, who'd been listening to them discuss his fate as if he weren't standing right there, finally exploded. "You can't just decide—" "Shut up, Frank." The words came from Tom Murphy, and they carried such unexpected authority that Frank actually obeyed. "For once in your miserable life, just shut up and listen." Tom moved out from behind the bar, his weathered face hard with resolve. "I've been running this saloon for 15 years. I've seen fights over cards, fights over women, fights over cattle and mining claims and Lord knows what else. But you know what I ain't seen? I ain't seen a man draw down on someone defending a woman from her own husband." He gestured toward Jake. "This stranger risked his life tonight for someone he don't even know. Makes the rest of us look pretty small, don't it?" Reverend Pike stepped forward, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the lamplight. "There's precedent for this, you know, in the scriptures and in law. A community has not just the right but the obligation to protect its innocent members." "What are you suggesting, Reverend?" asked Dr. Hayes. "I'm suggesting that Frank McKenna be given a choice." Pike's voice carried the weight of moral certainty. "He can leave Millbrook voluntarily tonight and never return. Or he can face the consequences of remaining in a town that will no longer tolerate his behavior." Frank's face went white. "You can't run me out of my own town." "I got rights." "Rights?" Jake's voice was soft, but it cut through Frank's bluster like a knife. "What rights did you give your wife? The right to live without fear? The right to walk down the street without having to explain away bruises? The right to sleep safely in her own home?" He took a step closer to Frank, his grey eyes hard as flint. "You forfeited your rights the first time you raised your hand to her. Everything since then has just been borrowed time." Sarah, who'd been listening to the discussion with a mixture of hope and terror, finally found her voice. "You don't understand. Frank will never just leave. He'll fight. People will get hurt because of me." "No," said a voice from the back of the saloon. Every head turned to see Charlie Mason, a quiet man who worked as the town's blacksmith. He was big, not as tall as Frank, but broader through the shoulders, with arms like tree trunks from years of working iron. "People get hurt because of him, not because of you." Charlie stood up slowly, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain rising from the earth. "I've been listening to this whole thing, and I keep thinking about my Mary. She died 3 years ago come winter, and every day since I've been asking myself what I wouldn't have given for just one more conversation with her, one more laugh, one more morning watching her cook breakfast." His voice grew thick with emotion. "Frank McKenna's got a woman who wants nothing more than to love him and make a home with him, and he's using his fists to drive her away. Makes me sick." Charlie's declaration seemed to open floodgates. Around the room, other voices began to speak up. "I saw Sarah at the church social last month," said Emily Watson, the schoolteacher. "She flinched every time a man came near her, even old Mr. Peterson, who's gentle as a lamb. My wife's been asking me for months why I don't do something," added Ben Foster, who owned the town's small lumber mill. "I kept telling her it wasn't our business. Guess I was wrong." One by one, the people of Millbrook began to stand, literally and figuratively. Margaret O'Sullivan crossed the room to Sarah's side, taking the trembling woman's hand. "Doctor." Hayes moved to join Reverend Pike. Tom Murphy came out from behind his bar. Charlie Mason walked forward until he stood shoulder to shoulder with Jake Russell. Frank McKenna found himself facing not just one cowboy with a gun, but an entire community that had finally found its backbone. "This is how it's going to be, Frank," Tom Murphy said, his voice steady and sure. "You're going to gather up whatever belongings you can carry, and you're going to ride out of Millbrook tonight. If you ever come back, if you ever bother Sarah or try to contact her in any way, you'll answer to all of us. And if I refuse?" Frank's voice was smaller now, the bluster draining out of him as he realized just how isolated he'd become. Jake Russell smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then you'll answer to me first, and Frank, I promise you won't enjoy that conversation." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Frank looked around the room one more time, searching for a friendly face, for someone who might take his side. He found nothing but hard stares and crossed arms. "Fine," he said finally, his voice bitter with defeat, "but don't think this changes anything. Sarah's still my wife, legally speaking. I got rights under the law." "The law," Reverend Pike said quietly, "is not always the same thing as justice. And tonight, justice is what we're serving." Frank stumbled toward the door, his earlier drunkenness seeming to return now that the adrenaline was wearing off. At the threshold, he turned back one last time. "You'll regret this," he said, but the words carried no real conviction. "All of you." "Maybe," Jake replied, "but we'll regret doing nothing a whole lot more." After Frank disappeared into the night, the saloon remained quiet for a long moment. Then Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, all of you. I never imagined—" "You don't need to thank us," Margaret O'Sullivan said firmly. "We should have acted sooner. Shame on us for letting it go on as long as it did." Jake Russell walked back to the bar and picked up his hat, settling it on his head with practiced ease. "Ma'am, you've got good people here. They just needed a reminder of who they really are." "You're leaving?" Sarah asked, and there was something like panic in her voice. "Frank's gone. You're safe. My work here is done." Tom Murphy poured another whiskey and slid it across the bar. "Stay for one more drink at least. Let us properly thank you." Jake considered for a moment, then picked up the glass. "One more. But then I ride." Dr. Hayes raised his own glass. "To doing the right thing, even when it's hard. To standing up for what matters," added Reverend Pike. "To new beginnings," said Margaret O'Sullivan, her arms still around Sarah's shoulders. One by one, every person in the saloon raised their glass. Even Sarah, with tears still fresh on her cheeks, managed a smile as she lifted her cold coffee cup. "To courage," Jake Russell said simply, and drained his whiskey. An hour later, as the first hints of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, Jake saddled his horse and prepared to leave Millbrook behind. Sarah stood on the porch of O'Sullivan's store, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, watching him prepare to ride out of her life as suddenly as he'd ridden into it. "Where will you go?" she asked. Jake checked his saddle one final time and swung up onto his horse. "West, always west. There's usually someone who needs help in the next town." "Will I ever see you again?" Jake touched the brim of his hat and smiled, the first genuinely warm smile she'd seen from him. "Maybe, but more importantly, you'll see yourself again. The woman you were before fear took over. She's still in there, Sarah. Don't let her stay hidden too long." As he rode away, the morning sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Sarah McKenna, soon to be Sarah something else she hoped, felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt free. Behind her, the people of Millbrook were already stirring, beginning another day in their small mountain town. But it would be different from all the days that had come before, because they had learned something important about themselves. They had learned that silence in the face of cruelty was its own form of cruelty. They had learned that good people sometimes need reminding of their own goodness. And they had learned that sometimes it takes a stranger with a gun and the courage to use it to show a community what it really means to care for one another. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the night's shadows, and Millbrook, Colorado, began the first day of what its people hoped would be a better future for them all.